Welcome everyone to our webinar on the AERA-NSF Grants Program. We hope that this will be informative to you and that you're thinking about submitting for a small grant, a dissertation support, or a small grant to seed a program of research that will be productive and significant to the field and in your careers. I am Felice Levine, Executive Director of the American Educational Research Association. And most important for today, I am Principal Investigator of the AERA Grants Program funded by the National Science Foundation. I am joined today who chairs our governing board and is John A. Hanna, University Distinguished Professor at Michigan State University. And we are joined with co-principal investigator at the for the AERA-NSF Grants Program and Director of Professional Development. Together, we're going to do a rapid fire introduction to the grants program, to the range and substance of important science that we're seeking to attract to advance our understanding of STEM education and learning, broadly understood and incorporated in our field, from individual level kinds of work to more systemic and macro level work. This is a program dedicated to advancing fundamental knowledge through the use of large-scale data assets, and Barbara Schneider will be talking more about that. I will give a little bit of an overview of the history of the program and what we aim to do, and George will follow Barbara with a focus on kind of do's, don'ts, things you should be thinking about in the event of a competitive proposal. We hope this webinar has lots of questions, so we're relying on you to use that Q&A function, because what will most help you is to ask the questions that that you want to know as you look toward our deadlines of, I believe, October 5th coming up soon, but still you've got some space and time, and January 20th. Are our two cycles for this year. The program has a long and distinguished history. It was founded in 1990. In the last, I suppose, 10-ish, 11 years, we have funded 250 dissertations and small grants. As I said in the introduction, NSF takes the lead in funding this very important initiative. In addition to providing important support to do the work that you want to do, it's also a program that helps build capacity together and training, and fosters high quality research. I mentioned Barbara Schneider as the chair of our board. Our board is very actively engaged in with our fellows in the various convenings and meetings we have, and takes very seriously us looking toward the next generation as not only important to each of you individually, but also the heart and soul of our field. The program has fostered important substantive advances, fosters infrastructural and innovations with respect to infrastructure and methodology, and we rely on your sparks of genius and commitment to help make that possible. The work products that you will do would be quite within the scope of what we expect from productive researchers in our field. Of course, if it's dissertation funding, we expect the dissertation to be done, but you're thinking about journal articles, book chapters, policy reports, and indeed in this last cycle of our awards program, we really have tried to work with our awardees, and will be doing so this year, on various aspects of public communication, so that the connection between the foundational work you're doing and communicating to diverse audiences, both possible and feasible. Next slide, George. The funding instruments, which is, obviously key. Without that kind of funding, it's hard to focus on a research program. The dissertation grants, we've actually just raised for this 5th year of the current 5-year award from NSF to $27,500. And the small research grants, when you craft that budget, need to be appropriate for what you're trying to do, both in the resources that you're asking for and also the duration. So that might be a 15-month award, that might be $27,500, it might be $25,000, or it might be 32 or 35. And the duration that you set would be appropriate for the project that you're proposing. We see this grants program, and I think the history of the grants program, and maybe why I sought to sort of speak first as PI, is this being, certainly we recognize, if we didn't recognize it before the last pandemic period, has been one where we fully recognize that resources and safe space to do fine work is really requisite. So not to in any sense trivialize the material support we provide, the program is one of capacity building and training. In November, we bring and we bring virtually this year our dissertation awardees and those who have completed research grants to kind of create that synergism about the reality and the possibility, and really begin that kind of networking process with presenters who come to the fall conference, and to members of the board who also participate actively. We do a poster session at the annual meeting, a capstone conference at the end of the meeting. If we were in a virtual meeting space, which we hope to be able to convene place-based in 2022, that the capstone conference would follow at the end of the meeting. So it's a networking opportunity. It's the conferences themselves provide substantive attention to the issues and challenges on your mind, methodological modules, and career development modules in a way that we hope really enhances your career and your career trajectories, and helps form a community of scholars among our multiple cohorts of awardees. With that sort of overview, I want to turn it over to Barbara Schneider, who will focus on the substance of this program and the great work that you're doing across arenas and levels of scholarship in STEM education research. Barbara?
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Felice. And hello to all of you, all 435 of you. So let's start with what these topics are that are, okay, at first I was told to turn off my video. Now I can
put it on. Right.
So anyway, let me begin by talking about the topical areas. These are not the questions, but areas. So the first one that you will see is student achievement at all levels. So that means student achievement, the outcomes could be achievement, achievement on test scores. It could be how far in school you get. It could be the courses that you take, and it could also be things related to social and emotional learning, which has, of course, become a much more important part of the curriculum that we've been looking at in terms of research questions. Now, the second area, which is very important, of course, because of our funder, who is a National Science Foundation, is mathematics and science education. And again, here, you're looking across the whole spectrum of math and science education, whether you're looking at math and science in higher education, or you're looking at math and sciences, how it's even done in preschool or kindergarten. And these could be studies about curriculum. These could be studies that deal with instructional practice, but these are very much focused on questions related to mathematics and science. Now, STEM and STEM learning, what does that mean? Well, that could mean a lot of things. It can also mean achievement in science scores. So if you were looking at NAEP, the report card from 2021 science, that would be something that you might want to be looking at trends. Or in fact, you could talk about STEM learning as STEM learning is taught in post-secondary education, and then what kinds of careers people take after completing that, their education, and what kind of support do they get for STEM learning when they're in post-secondary education. And then you've got parent involvement, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with the kinds of things that families can do to support education and what are some of the barriers and limitations that often happen in people's lives that make it difficult for their children to have learning opportunities. So parent involvement continues to be a very important part of the group of proposals that we fund, especially when they're related to specific kinds of outcomes. So remember that this is really kind of an opportunity to look at predictors of parent involvement and the consequence of that. And then higher education, well, I've talked a little bit about that now, but you should not think that this program only supports elementary and secondary education. This is a program that's also very interested in what goes on in higher education and relies on iPads and a number of other data sets, including those at NSF, that deal with indicators about higher education. And then there's issues about school organization and finance. And these are things that there are hosts of data sets that are available that deal with different kinds of tax benefits, different kinds of things that are part of the federal data sets, but you want to bring those into the kinds of education data sets that we look at. So school organization, these are things like how schools are organized, what kinds of leadership goes on in schools, again, with some kind of a measure as an outcome. And then, of course, we're always interested in understanding issues of diversity and inclusion. Equity is a major consideration of the kinds of proposals that we look at. So questions about opportunity structures and learning are very important. And for that, we're always interested in trying to understand things related to race, ethnicity, and gender. And here we take a very broad and wide approach to what that entails. So relying on the data sets that are currently available, including those in the census, can be very helpful in defining these areas. And then there can be proposals, and we do get them and we do fund them, that are methodological. So these are ones that deal with anything from looking at psychometric properties of different kinds of data sets and what they mean with respect to the reliability of what they're supposed to measure, different ways to think about how you're going to define your variables, and then what you're going to get as an outcome and how reliable that outcome might be, and what are some of the conditions that might be affecting it. And of course, we're always interested lately in things related to machine learning and what's happening in machine learning and simulations that in fact we can use the data sets that are available to find answers to very important questions. And then of course, there's always the issue of policy. And policies are in all of the data sets, and it allows you to understand, to be able to build different kinds of quasi-experiments with these data sets, so that you give us a really clear pathway of understanding what certain kinds of policies are having on student achievement, on access to higher education. So these are kind of the very broad areas, but not the questions. The questions come from you that we are very interested in looking at. Now, what kinds of data sets do we support? Well, we certainly are looking at the high school longitudinal studies, all of the longitudinal studies that are in what NCES calls their longitudinal grouping are ones that we're very interested in looking at. So there, it's not only the ones that are shown here, but for example, you might want to take ones that were from a while ago, like high school and beyond, and look and see how they can be harmonized with ones today to understand certain kinds of trends or to ask certain kinds of questions to understand what's happened to people in one time period as opposed to another. And then there is Ad Health. For those of you who understand and know about Ad Health, this was one of the very first studies that allowed for certain kinds of biomarkers and then have followed a group of students all the way into adulthood. And the beauty of that particular study is that it has an education component that is really very strong and very interesting, especially as it relates to transcripts and the kinds of activities that students are exposed to when they're in middle school and high school. And then there's TIMS. TIMS is a very important one for us because of the fact that it looks at mathematics and science. Now, that doesn't mean that we're excluding PISA. We're always interested in PISA, but we would hope that if you are interested in PISA, that you bring in some of these other data sets as well. And then, of course, there's NAEP, which no large-scale program that's looking for proposals could be without NAEP. NAEP is probably the most extensive kind of trend studies we have for grades 4th, 8th, and 12th. And then comes the higher education data sets, and those are baccalaureate and beyond. And we also have some other data sets that are in that whole suite of post-secondary education data sets. And if you go to NCES and you pull those down, you'll be able to get a very good handle on what those higher education data sets entail, including something like iPads. And iPads is really important because it gives so much information on institutions of higher education that become very useful, especially as covariates. Now, there's this U.S. Census, the survey. The U.S. Census is independent, of course, from the Survey of Earned Doctorates, which the Survey of Earned Doctorates is a National Science Foundation database, and the Common Core of Data, which fits more closely with the U.S. Census. In addition to the Common Core of Data, of course, is the data set that Sean Reardon has put together, the CETA data set that can be linked here as well as the American Community Survey. So if you think about the U.S. Census, Common Core of Data, CETA, that's another whole set of different kinds of data that you could use. And then, of course, are the state longitudinal data systems that the U.S. government has put a great deal of resources into and are really becoming a very important source of information for what's happening in particular states and how states can be looked at in combination with each other. So that's kind of a very broad view. The issue of civil rights is one that I didn't mention that I'm sorry, I skipped over that one. And that's a really key one. There is certain information in civil rights that doesn't exist anywhere else. And this can be a very important data set to look at and to understand. And we have done some funding of proposals that have used that data set. Okay, so those are the areas. These are the data sets. So what do we look for in terms of analysis? Well, our interest is always in trying to understand cause and effect, so that the kinds of questions that we tend to look at are those that are really quasi-experimental, although we do support descriptive work. But what we really would like to see for this particular program are really the most advanced work that's going on methodologically, that is trying to get a better handle on how we can make stronger predictions and what kinds of impact we can assess based on the kinds of data sets that we have here that are not randomized controlled trials. So the consequence of that is that we're interested in rigorous methods in quantitative work, which include propensity score matching, but I want to say very clearly right now that propensity score matching is not an end of itself. That is an opportunity that allows us to understand sample selection processes. It should not be thought of in terms of a outcome by itself. Regression discontinuity designs are really very helpful in terms of trying to understand different kinds of things that you can look at. For example, there are different policies, there are different kinds of programs that have a way to look at admission criteria so that you can actually set up a very interesting quasi-experiment with regression discontinuity designs. And then, of course, there's always regression analysis, multi-level modeling, simultaneous equation modeling. So essentially, for those people that are in this particular space of quantitative methodology, this is a place for you, which isn't to say that every once in a while we'll get some fabulous work that someone has proposed with these great quantitative methods, and they'll also bring in some descriptive work that has gone on in another part of their life that helps to validate and bring reliability to the work that's going on. But essentially, this is a program for people that are interested in quantitative methods. Quantitative methods that work with the data sets that are in slide 7 on topics pretty much related to those that are in slide 6. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Professor Schneider. Well, one of the things, a big question we always get is, so what makes a proposal competitive? And we get a lot of email messages and phone calls and things, and people wanting to talk more about this, want to know what is it that they need to do so their proposal is competitive and may be selected. The first thing I always tell people is that refer to our call for proposals. It's on our website. There's a call that's for the dissertation grants and a separate call for the research grants. It clearly describes not only the program, but what goes into the proposal and the format of the proposal and the structure of the proposal. That's clearly defined in the call, and it's great. You know, it's so important that you do follow those guidelines. And also that the proposals that are clear and concise. There are page limitations that are set for the dissertation and for the research grant proposals, that your proposals are within those page limits, and that it's clear and you're able to clearly talk about your research, what you're planning to do. Also, as we're thinking about this research, that we want things that I always like to think about as this is research that is going to advance knowledge and methods in the field, or in a sense, move the needle in how we think about this particular topic. What's going to be new that's here? That the research that you're proposing is the salient research topic that's supported by the literature, and that you're able to draw upon the literature and cite the literature very clearly and concisely in your proposal. That is there. Then as you get into the methods of your work, and the methods and the design of your study, that the measures are clearly defined. So if you are talking about student achievement in mathematics using a data set, which measures in the data set are you using? And is it, if so, for example, if there's a mathematics that we're clear, is it Algebra 1? And this was when most students were taking this, say, in 8th grade or in 9th grade, and they actually drawing very clearly even the variables and that are from these data sets, for example. That is clear. We know exactly how you're measuring what you are seeking to measure in your study. And just as Barbara talked about, many of the rigorous and appropriate statistical techniques that you're using in your study, it's always very important as well. These are some of the elements that really do make for a very competitive proposal in some of the proposals that in studies that we end up funding. A good resource that's been around for a while, and I still refer people to this, is an article from the Social Science Research Council on the art of writing proposals, and there's a link to that here on the slide. I always refer people to that. It really gives you a good overview, just in general, about what goes into a good proposal in general. But at the same time, we get a lot of proposals each year, in each cycle, and there are some pitfalls that I think these are sort of the I'll say, or pitfalls, or sometimes fatal flaws sometimes that happen with studies. And so one of the big ones is that if you can't effectively address the topic with the selected data sets, for example, that's a big one. So if you really know that you're focusing on, say, students in 9th grade, for example, but then maybe the data set is, if it's one of the early childhood data sets that goes up to 8th grade, or if your research questions are about student level performance, but you cite studies that that report the data only in the aggregate. So some of those type of issues. If the scope of your research is limited, because these are, for the most part, these are state and national data sets. So, but sometimes if there's research that your research is focusing, say, only on at the school level, at one school, for example, or a set of schools, but yet we can't generalize to the state or nationally. Other times it could be a data set that's ineligible. It could be a very, you could have a great research question and a well-designed study and all too, but maybe this is a study that's not, the data set is not federally supported, as in the data sets that we have defined and then described here. And I always say to people too, if you have any questions about the data set that you're using, please feel free to reach out to us. And you can always email us directly. We will respond to you, and it may even ask you for more information about the data set, but just to make sure that it is eligible. Other issues come up, that things around selection bias needs to be definitely discussed in your methods section, and some of those things are actually even laid out in the call, asking you to make sure that you're addressing issues such as selection bias. Other things, and another pitfall, is that when the methods section is missing information, it's rather vague, and it's very important to give as much detail as possible in the space that you can, how you plan to conduct this study. Then there are other things that pitfalls. When we're evaluating the proposals, if there's really nothing new here, if there's nothing new that will be learned, this is something that's been done before, and it's no longer, and there's much research here already on the topic, and we can't see if there's, so what's going to happen with this new study? And not only if there is something new, that you're actually very clear about what that new thing is. Is it something about the data set, and that we have a new time period, for example, from this data set, or there's a new topic, a new way of looking at a very familiar topic in education research? All very important. So one of the things that we've done trying now is to really help us, after you've developed your proposal and all, and you're working on this. So I know we have this, our next deadline is coming up in October, early October here. So to really just to go through your proposal, and I always call this checklist, go through and just to make sure that you clearly have, you're following our guidelines. We know what the issue or the problem is that you're addressing. You're very clear that there is a theoretical or a conceptual framework that is driving your study, and that is laid out in the proposal. The research questions are clearly defined, that we can actually pick up the proposal and someone can just say, oh, here are the 3 research questions. That's always this, for example, and it's clear what these are. You've talked about things about how this is going to contribute to education and education research field, how it's going to contribute to STEM education, for example, definitely very important. I already said some things about your measures that you're using. That also, and the appropriateness of the data sets for this research. So it could be, and one thing too is that it's really neat. We've had some studies that they're linking different data sets. So maybe you are using something like the high school longitudinal study, and you're able to link it to the U.S. Census, for example, or there's even or using some of the state data and you're linking to something like to the census or some of the Common Core data. Other things around having a very clear data analysis plan, what you plan to do, and that is clearly laid out. Issues again of selection bias, that's there, that you can actually check those things off. And now I always think the last 2 things are so important, is that in the end, for those working in the dissertation grants, that definitely that your advisor, your dissertation chairperson has reviewed this proposal before you actually go into our portal and hit the submit button, that the person who's going to be writing for you, they have seen this proposal clearly that you're going to submit to us. And for our other colleagues, our postdoctoral or faculty colleagues who are submitting for our research grants, that you've had another colleague, external person, to review the proposal. That another scholar, researcher has actually gone through and actually, because sometimes what will happen is that person can point out, if one of the pitfalls, or for example, where there's something that's not clear. So it's one of those things that these can take a lot of time to develop a really good, solid proposal. Taking that time, but it's also very important. Some things are just very simple. As I said, if you go back onto the call, you will see that what we ask are just in general for dissertation grants, that you're preparing an abstract. We go through the elements of the proposal narrative that are in the call, that you are including your variables, that these can even be included in an appendix, that you're actually, you're naming the variables and the questions that you're drawing from these secondary sources, that we're very clear about those. That are for our graduate students, that there is a budget for the 1 year, is we usually give for these dissertation studies. Expenses that you can have, living expenses that you can budget for, any research related expenses, equipment type things, if it's software or computer time, internet access, those type things can all be included in the budget. Tuition, although we definitely do like when your home institution will, often they're so proud that you get these awards that they will waive your tuition for anyone who is awarded these fellowships. You should probably talk to your dean's office or office of sponsored programs. They may even have some other guidelines for the budget as you are putting things together for this proposal. Other things, unlimited curriculum vitae of 2 pages, and that's also laid out in the proposal guidelines that you'll see online, and 1 letter of support that is that's clearly defined there too, that we need 1 letter from someone, usually your dissertation chairperson. If this person if your chairperson of your dissertation is, say, not in education research specifically, we'll ask that not only do you have a letter from that person, but also for someone who is, say, on your committee, who is a quantitative researcher who is specifically doing education research. And our next deadline for all materials is due, again here, October 5th. As for dissertation grants, research grants are a little different. You have a little bit more space to talk about in your proposal. These are a little bit more extensive grants. Where there's, again, we're asking for the abstract and some literature and going through all your own, also for what previous work that you have done. So for a lot of times, these research grants are going to people early in their career. So they may be someone who finished the doctorate within the last, say 1 to 7 years, and they're launching the career, launching their research, and how is it that this study is different or from, say, your dissertation work? And there are questions about that. So it's not necessarily, oh, so you did your dissertation, for example, it's complete, and that uses something like, say, the NAEP data, and that you're not just replicating your dissertation, but how if you're taking your previous work, how does this study take it to the next level? How are you taking that next step? Again, you have more space here, 7 pages in the proposal narrative, as well as you can add things around the variables that you're using, just similar to as we did for our dissertation grantees. One thing that we have said for the research grants, these can be up to $35,000 that's budgeted for a maximum of 2 years of time. And I always encourage you, as with your budget, you may need again to also work with your office of sponsored programs at your institution. Things that we asked, your VITA with relevant publications and any employment, and any other current funding support that you have. Now, what's already being, say, if it's from your institution or from other federal sources like NSF or NIH, for example, that's all very clear in your proposal. And also, our research grants are due October 5th as well as our next deadline. If you have any questions about any of these things, you can always feel free, again, to email us directly at AERA, a grants program at AERA, and we'll definitely display that email a couple of times here and put it into the chat as well. We're more than happy and willing to answer your questions and to be able to go over anything that you may have about clearing up things around budget or eligibility of your data set, your study. So with that, I think we're going to open up to some general questions. I know that there have been some of you have already been putting questions into the Q&A box, and we summarize some of those. We have a little bit of time here for this next half hour that Felice, Barbara, and I will accept your questions. So let's open up for, well, actually, as we open up for questions, I do have one thing that I'm going to direct a question. Primarily focusing this, I think I'm going to direct this question more to Barbara Schneider about some of the state data. And can you speak to some of the studies that we have funded and things around using the state data and how one might access state data, for example?
So one person who is getting hooded on Friday, for example, Christopher Klager had an AERA dissertation grant, and he used the AERA dissertation grant to look at the administrative data in the state of Michigan that was in the state of Michigan longitudinal data sets, as well as data from ELS and I think also HSLS. And because the one that has the transcripts, so he was very interested in trying to understand what kinds of learning opportunities students receive in STEM in different kinds of schools and what impact policy has on that. So the state administrative data sets can be really very beneficial, especially in terms of understanding trends, because some of the states actually keep these very long longitudinal data files on students across their spectrum. So you might be able to look at their test scores when they were in elementary school, when they were in high school, and then as they move on out to the kinds of colleges that they go to. Some of the state data sets have already linked in to the National Student Clearinghouse, so you can actually find out where, in fact, students are and have gone. I think that for me, the interesting thing about the state data now is that with changes that are occurring so rapidly, and given the size of so many of our states, the size of our states are actually the size of many countries in Europe. So for example, the state of Michigan has nearly the same amount of people as Finland. So when you end up with these kinds of large scale state numbers, you're getting a very unusual picture that you don't easily get in other kinds of places. And with the newest kinds of generalizability programs that are out there, you're able to even figure out, if you had a state data set, how well that would generalize to other states in the union. So I think that this is a really rich data source. And for those of you that are at all interested in finding out more, or how Chris Klager used it, he graduated in 2020 from Michigan State University. And he will be very happy, I'm sure, to share with all of you. He is at Northwestern now, and he is the executive director of their STEPS Center in the Policy Center. So that's KLAGER, and he can tell you a lot more than I could about all of this. Thank you.
I think for those interested in any of the projects that have been funded, they're at least in they're frequently stories and highlights. We can post them with these materials that are sort of overviews about our awardees for the dissertation awards and grants. And Barbara's illustration of the data sets listed are not exhaustive of the data sets that could be used. And so, for example, there was a question posted about the use of some CDC data sets. I think it was CDC data sets. And we're interested in promoting our understanding of education and learning at all levels of analysis using large-scale data systems. So CETA that we made reference to, this the Stanford Education Research Data Archive, is a school district, national school district data set that is administrative data. We've increasingly recognized both in our program and in our scientific field that administrative data appropriately crafted and drawn and developed have a great deal of potential in their own terms or as linked to other data sets. So I think there's several questions that I've noticed posted around that. Will you entertain proposals from nationally representative data sets from other federal sources, for example, from the CDC? And the answer is yes. If you're doing work that you're somewhat ambiguous about, I think there was one question about an NSF funded longitudinal study in 15 institutions. There's no there. It is, you know, if that, I will say what, and there was another question about examining data that's collected in the corporate sector, other forms of big data that would speak to educational issues. I would say two things. The NSF data, of course, would be more generally available for multi-investigator use. So if it's data that, that are large scale and can command addressing important scientific questions, a longitudinal study at 15 institutions is surely entertainable. But if you have ambiguity, email the program and, you know, George and I will confer and you know, and similarly, you know, get back to you. There were a number of questions on the privatized section. I did want to say, even or other forms of big data that might link, for example, to one of these data sets, those two are entertainable. But this program is very much committed to advancing knowledge with data that can be tested, replicated by others. So if you have access to a restricted data set, that doesn't mean you shouldn't come into the program, but you would then share at the end of your study the algorithms, the code, so that others seeking that restricted data under similar conditions could execute the same analyses for either addressing new questions or similar questions. There was one question, which I'm going to jump, I think I'm going to pop over to my colleagues, but it was, I thought, an important question about doing a comparative study in STEM education and learning. I don't remember the specifics around that. And that would be examining questions with data that don't include the United States. We are oriented to advancing fundamental knowledge. We certainly like to have that work speak to policy issues. I'm going to ask my colleagues to address that, because I think that's a issue that we are certainly not mechanistic about, but are seeking to encourage the inclusion of U.S. institutions, contexts, and learning experience in our work. So, George, what would you say in answer to that question?
Well, I think one of the things that's always important in these studies is that it's great when we are looking at, you're able to make these type of comparisons and sort of the why you're making a comparison to other nations and all that. That's very clear in the literature and why this is an important issue. But also but the U.S. is part of the focus, and understanding, you know, what is it that we're learning, say, from another context or country, as to how that might influence education in the U.S., both policy and for practice type of things. That is clear part of your argument.
I think there were a few questions about collaboration. Yes, no?
Do you want to speak to, yes, but did you want to speak to the international?
Well, I think that, for example, PISA and TIMSS would be really important ones, because they're large-scale quantitative databases by which the U.S. is a part. And you could, in fact, and the U.S. supports both TIMSS and PISA. And so they would become really very valuable in terms of this particular program. Additionally, you would be able to look at some of the results in PISA as well as in TIMSS and relate them to the National Longitudinal Studies and NAEP, because you have overlapping grade levels. So there is no kind of, well, no, we don't support work that is international. However, if you are writing a dissertation, we do, in fact, try, and if it's a 3-paper dissertation, one of the papers has to do with a foreign country, that is fine, but don't ask for support for that chapter. Instead, keep the chapter that is doing the quantitative work using the international and national data sets that are supported by the U.S. The other thing is that dissertations are individually supported. Research grants can be collaborative. So those of you that asked about dissertations that have students mining data, no, that's not a very good choice. And another one, if you have a chapter in your dissertation that's co-authored, which happens now more frequently, that's not a problem, providing that the research grant that you're proposing is your research grant. We don't have, enough to give you both that, and this should be, I'm assuming that probably was with a more senior person. So that's another very important point to make. And I would like to underscore several things, because the most important part certainly is you have to have the right data set. But the question that you're asking really has to be one that you're passionate about, that's close to your heart, and you think that these data sets can answer. Because one of the parts of the proposal that's really important is that part where you can connect your research question with the existing theories that are out there and why you're investigating these questions with these kinds of data, because then you're building a rationale for your variables, both your covariates, your independent variables, as well as your outcome variables. So please be sure you think hard about your question and then think about the kinds of data sets that you can use to make that happen, and explore them before you write your proposal. Because one of the things that you can run into is that sometimes there are variables that have no variation, so it doesn't make sense to put them in. Sometimes there are variables that may be very gender specific, and again, they'll make very unusual estimates if you put them in that way. So I think it's really important to look and have a better feel for what these data elements say, what are the properties of them, making sure that they have variation, and then you will have a much better proposal.
The one thing I want to emphasize is that there's a couple of questions about the cycles of submission. Both cycles of submission are eligible for dissertation proposals or research proposals. We don't have a mental map any longer of what a dissertation needs to look like. So if it's a 3-article dissertation, 3 sub-studies, as long as it is meeting the requirements for completion of your doctorate in your department. Someone also asked, at what stage can you submit for support for doctoral research? It is not a program of support for doctoral education. It is a program on the dissertation side to support the dissertation, so that it should be at the point at which your chair is essentially attesting to, this is the work that you're doing with your committee. It does not have to yet have begun, but that in many cases, of course, it hasn't begun. The one important thing is you're using extant data. This isn't a program for in any way that we would encourage going around and dredging for the right data set for some problem. So you'll want to have enough confidence by virtue of your communication with your advisor and your committee that this data is appropriate and can address those questions, and that will be something you'll address in the proposal. But that as much as we would love to have a program of support that's a training grant for doctoral training, this is oriented to the dissertation stage, at the point at which your recommender and your chair is saying, yes, it's a go. George, have you noticed other items?
I think that's one of the things too, is I just want to reiterate that in terms of that these are the dissertation grant is meant as a 1-year sort of write-up grant. So at that final stage, if you think you're going to finish in the next year or so, this is a good time to apply. That even we can start awards usually fairly quickly. So those that are due October 5th, for example, many of those awards will probably start as early as January of 2022. I think that's what's really important to know. Or they could start as late as next summer or next fall. So if this is, as you are thinking of this as that last stage of writing up your dissertation. It's along a similar line though, for research grantees, our requirement is that you have your doctoral degree. And that could have been from just 1 year ago, or it could have been from several years ago. We've even had some senior scholars recently that have been awarded. We do encourage when there are projects, the research grant, where there can be collaboration with other scholars in those projects. And it's also been great too, though, when there are times or two where your parts of your project, maybe you have brought in undergraduates or other graduate students who are using the data set, learning to use the data sets. So, and encouraging that multiple generations to be involved in larger projects.
There's an anonymous question. We're anonymizing or de-identifying all, but are there any AERA training or grant writing related to secondary data for doctoral students and early career researchers? And at our grants board meeting, we recently discussed indeed creating such a workshop. This program is, this program has a particular focus on examining large-scale databases through quantitative analysis, and it would be well worthwhile not just to give the abbreviated version of what our expectations are, but what forms, how you should be thinking about proposal development. Now, a number of years ago, I think 2006, Barbara was on a committee that I had the honor of also serving, that we considered it to be guidelines for addressing substantive issues in the publishing process. Actually, if you read those guidelines, they're the kind of guideline that you need to be thinking about for the development of a competitive proposal. Some of those were set forth in the tips, and we are more than actively thinking, although we don't have it scheduled, of having some form of grant writing workshops that would focus on the analysis of secondary data. So the question is both well received and on point in terms of our planning. There was a question also about the eligibility, and I made some reference to CDC data about, for example, using other data sets at the Department of Education or elsewhere. We made reference to the civil rights data collection and system as being highly appropriate. There's a question about TRIO data, program data. Is it possible to seek support? And that is somewhat like my response to the business data. As long as those data are not privatized in their availability, that what you're doing with these data could be examined on those questions or other questions through a similar process of seeking those data. So that many of you would be using, of course, restricted data under site licenses that you would be applying for. I see some question about, can we help inform you how to do that? And I think if you immediately have a question, hopefully there's a good advisor in your institution who can help you learn the ropes of gaining access to the restricted data files of some of the large scale data systems available. Most of the agencies like IES and NCS and NSF are pretty transparent about that process, but it is somewhat formidable the first time. If you're submitting and need some tips, raise your questions with us if you don't have the appropriate help resources at your own institution, whether it's a dissertation grant or a small grant.
So with regret, I say this because I cross multiple methodologies in all of my work, but this is not a program to submit a qualitative dissertation. This is not a program that supports strictly qualitative work. And I think that it's better if we just put that out there and say that so that people don't get confused. If you have a qualitative database that is answering a particular kind of question, These kinds of studies can be funded in other kinds of fellowship programs, but not in this fellowship program currently as it's configured. So I think that that's a very important thing to get out of the way. The second thing is, no, you don't have to be working. You could be working on your dissertation to be able to receive this award. And let's talk a little bit about these restrictive data sets just for a minute. There is information in the restricted data sets that are very valuable. Certain kinds of things, that variables that they don't put on the public use data set. And it really is a case that if you know what's in that restricted data set, that could in fact help you hone your question in much better. However, there are certain types of procedures that in fact your institution has to undertake to be able to make that eligible for you. So you can't apply for a restricted data set for your dissertation in this program if you were building that at home. That would be a bit of a problem because those restricted data sets are really built with an understanding that you are available for an audit should you be audited. And people will come, and I have been audited, and look at how secure are your data sets, the room that we have it in, the specialized computer that we use, and the specialized printer that is connected to that computer. So every kind of, the question about, no, this really doesn't support restricted data for home use, but it does help to support restricted data for institutional use. But most of the restricted data sets that are available, the institute has an institutional cost sometimes, but not something that is usually trickles down to the investigator. There was another question about methodology, and I think that we might want to spend just a few minutes on that. So one of the most important things when we do any kind of work is dealing with questions related to selection bias. Is there something about the sample that we have that in some way doesn't make sense because there are certain populations in the sample for whom this is true and others for whom it is not? So you have to be very careful with issues about selection, especially when you're using quasi-experimental methodologies. One of the things that people have talked about is that, well, if I do propensity score matching, I can figure this out through that. Well, that doesn't exactly all the time figure it out. And there's a whole series of different kinds of methodologies that you want to employ to basically get a good estimate of your outcome variable. You could, in fact, look for an instrumental variable that might be useful. Howard Bloom wrote a great paper once that dealt with an instrumental variable and how he used it. That was very interesting. I think that it is really on the part of the investigator to become more fully aware of the different kinds of methodologies that are available and what their limits are, so that you don't think, well, I put a propensity score match in, I don't have to worry about this question anymore. You always have to worry about your question, and you want to use multiple methodologies. And that's what I was talking about. Don't rush to say that you've got an effect for your outcome unless you've really interrogated your data fully through all the methods that are currently available for your use to be able to know that that what you are actually assessing is in fact as close to what we could know with the data set we have, and that the prediction that we're making is solid, and that it's been done with a host of rigorous methods.
There was a question about whether you have to secure your site license in advance. What you certainly need to do, and that's what a proposal is aiming to do, is to communicate and engender confidence that you know what's in store for you. And so, you know, having a sense that you'll be able to obtain it, of course, having obtained it or being along the way of obtaining it or being part of a site licensed for use of certain data that includes you on it is certainly something to think about. It's not one of the checkoff requirements, but a proposal in general is trying to communicate, not that everything is nailed down and walks on water, but that you're engendering confidence that you've got a good idea, a good set of questions, a methodology, an appropriate data set, and that you've got the logistics in hand to be able to do so. There was a question, there's been a whole set of questions about, I suppose, citizenship and non-US, not non-US research, but locations in non-US environments. Awards, research grants, or dissertation funding is through and with US institutions. We collaborate with those institutions insofar as AERA does not, or the grant does not support overhead, but citizenship is not a requirement. Many of our awardees are working in US institutions or studying in US institutions, and we're interested in the support of quality work. Yes, that work is done in US institutions. If it is collaborative with someone outside of the United States, it can be work that AERA or this grant is supporting the US portion of that work, meaning that investigator that could be met with funding from other funding sources for the collaborator. I think I am scrolling. George, you probably have been scrolling. I see some questions about tables and figures, and yes, they can be in the submission. Actually, sometimes a powerful table can say a lot more than 3 paragraphs. But we've actually put an emphasis on not having you think you need to include, the 10 experiments are in appendices A, B, C, and D. So, so we don't include appendices for that work. We're really trying to be facile and expeditious in considering quality work and get your work started, whether it's a dissertation or a kind of a B-Start grant. We don't want you to feel or to see this as really a surrogate for a 15-page NSF proposal and that you're going to be using appendices. And I suppose our evolving this checklist is to say what you need to say to engender that confidence without seeking you're investing in a lot of the kind of detail that might be set forth in a lot of appendices.
The PI of the dissertation grant is you.
Yeah.
Not your advisor. It's you. So please, when you're talking to your advisor, please explain. They cannot be the PI. You're the PI. Now, in certain institutions, because of the way that the money comes, they may be the person who signs off on the money or establishes the account, but basically you are the PI.
Yeah.
The money is yours.
There could be some, I'm going to say not with our program, but historical confusion, because NSF's dissertation grants through their own dissertation programs had the advisor as the PI. So that question may be reflecting that, but I actually even think NSF is gravitating to that. And I know we're running close to the end of our time. I wanted to comment for those of you, Barbara's right on that, that in order for agencies and institutions providing access to restricted data, including state longitudinal administrative data, the intention is for it to be in a secure location. And so that has been institutionally located. Now, having said that, during this COVID period, federal agencies that do include NCS and NSF are attentive to trying to think about what this means when you can't be place-based. So whether there are accessible VPN access to restricted files in a way that could create firewalls. There is no departure from what Barbara said. I just want everyone to know that federal agencies that don't want to have a disruption in your work, and we will need to follow their guidance, of course, because they would be setting the procedures, are really giving this, really active consideration.
And I should say one more thing, because the American Rescue Act is also providing for certain kinds of funding to go to graduate students that were hurt by the COVID process, that were working on different kinds of grants. So that's another thing that's currently underway simply because of the fact of COVID. But I think that for most people, the important thing to remember is that the federal government wants us to open up. They'll want certain kinds of things to happen. So I imagine there might be guidelines in the future, but if you plan on using restricted data, I think it's better to think about using that in an institution where you're secure in terms of your own health and that the data are secure.
All right, well, I think we want to be respectful of your time. We will go through the questions. The webinar itself will become available on the AERA website shortly. We'll go through the questions and be sure that we have not missed any nuggets of inquiry. Those questions, whether in chat or in Q&A that are identified, you've registered, and we will try to get back to you with either an aggregated answer or a response if several of you have a similar line of inquiry. I want to especially, there have been 3 of us who have led this webinar, but I want to especially thank our ASL colleagues who have been signing, Kabarski and Jorge for just doing a fabulous job, probably filling in many of our own verbal stumbles to make the ASL even better than the words that we've stated, and also Eduardo, who's been doing the closed captioning. We will have available that closed captioning as a transcript along with the video to make it an accessible product for those who would be reading rather than viewing. With that, I just want to thank you all for coming, for really launching careers in this area where the work that you do is our future. Don't be inhibited about submitting. I saw a few questions about, do you have to have a deep publication record to submit a competitive proposal? And the answer is no. Showing some track record appropriate to career stage that you're moving forward, that just might have been a great dissertation. We certainly want to work with you on disseminating your work and being an accomplished scholar. But we would not have a program like this if we expected you to be fully minted and ready for emeritus status. This program is really about the future and advancing science around STEM broadly construed. So the question, for example, about medical education, we see STEM, of course, and so does federal agencies, as including understandings of capacity building across science and learning broadly construed, including science and learning around adult education and professional education. If you have questions, you just send an email to the program, and if it's a straightforward question, we'll get back to you by email. If not, we toss it to George, and he'll give you a really terrific response or set up a call. I am privileged to be able to work with George day to day, and I want to say about Barbara, who's chair of our board. We work with Barbara day to day. She's not some chair of our board that presides and expects the nuggets of applause. She's really an active part of our program, and that's why we wanted her to be with us. She says yes before we even tell her what date it is. So with that, I want to close. And George and Barbara, any further?
No, except I look forward to seeing all your proposals.
Right. Well, 226 of them, right?
Right. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Yes, thank you everyone again for joining us today. I did put the PowerPoint into the chat, so if you wanted to get access to that, the actual slides, so they are in the chat. Our next deadline is coming up here soon, October 5th. Any questions about your data set or eligibility, like we're saying, just reach out to us and we'll address those questions promptly.
Great. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.